to people.
Mm-hmm. Now, just so our listeners know, you mentioned Gail just a second ago, which we do have Gail with us, and that's your daughter, correct?
Right.
And she co-authored Mysteries of Atlantis with you?
Right. Three of us did it. This was a book on... I originally wrote a book called Edgar Cayce on Atlantis back in 1968. In some of his life readings, he mentioned the continent of Atlantis, and of course, it's really been a myth for a long time. Nobody knew whether to believe it or not. Plato wrote the first article about it back in years ago, when Plato lived about 500 B.C. He said that Solon talked to some Egyptian priest in Egypt, and they told him about a continent that was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules was the entrance to the Mediterranean, and they said that continent existed about 9,000 years ago, and that it was sunk in a volcanic and tidal waves and catastrophe, and that the people had been before that they had been invading the Mediterranean, and when the Atlantis sunk, of course, they had no place to go back to home. Atlantis was gone.
Right. Now,
that was the first mention of it. Now, a lot of people since have talked about it. There are a lot of myths and a lot of stories in England and in Scotland and in Portugal and other countries in Europe, the European coast, have myths and stories of a continent or a land out in the South Atlantic a long time ago, but there hasn't been any evidence of it so far. But the book that we wrote tries to investigate some of the myths and find out whether there's any foundation for it or not. And Dr. Doug Richards, who got his degree at the doctorate degree at the University of North Carolina, and Gail Cayce and myself wrote this book. We all wrote about a third of it, and we tried to start with what Cayce said about Atlantis, and then what other people had said about Atlantis, some for it and some against it, and what evidence that there is for it. Now, there's no proof of it so far, but there's been a lot of interesting evidence turn up.
Now, was Atlantis just something? I mean, it's one of Edgar Cayce's most well-known readings on a location that he done. Was he really fascinated with this, the myth of Atlantis and the possibility of it really existing?
Well, I think everybody in the family was. I know I was, and that's why I spent a lot of time trying to dig up information on it and see if there was anything to it. And I spent a year. I thought that I could go down there and look at all the readings that mentioned Atlantis and see if there was any way that you could prove it. And I thought I could do it in a month or two, but I went down to the association for about 3 days a week for 2 or 3 hours a night, and it took me a year to look at all the readings on Atlantis. Now, the readings, we have copies of all the readings that Cayce gave from about the early 20s or just a little before 1920, up to the present time he died in 45, and a lot of those, about I say 20% of them are life readings, and of the 2,500 life readings, there are about 700 that mention Atlantis and incarnations in Atlantis, and some of them give dates and some of them don't. It sounded like, from the information that I was able to get out of the readings, that it was a continent that existed probably 200,000 years ago, and that man had been in the earth a lot longer than most people thought then. And this was the first reading on Atlantis that mentioned Atlantis was about 1923. Now, of course, the ideas of geology and archaeology were a lot different then than they are now. And when he said that that people had been in the earth for for millions of years instead of a few 100,000, that man had been in the earth for millions of years, and that Atlantis existed 50,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, and the last, it was a volcanic eruption that split the continent into islands, and at about 50,000 BC or 28,000 BC, and that there was one in about 10,000 BC that sunk the remaining islands, and that was the one that Plato referred to. Mm-hmm. So it sounded all so crazy, but now, since interesting enough, the investigations from the discoveries and scientific discoveries since those first readings were given, we've got that was before radiocarbon dating in the 20s, but see now there were radiocarbon dates of man in North America and Pennsylvania in 19,000 years ago, California 20,000 years ago, South America 35,000 years ago. So it's turning out that people were in the earth in the places he said they were at the times he said they were. And he mentioned pole shifts, and nobody thought the poles had ever shifted, and there's good evidence the poles have shifted in the past, and that all the new discoveries are very continue to show that what he said about the past was accurate. And one thing, and I guess the most recent thing about Atlantis is about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a company called ADC Company. It was a Canadian company that had a contract with the Cuban government to look for sunken ships. They were looking for gold, pirate ships off the Cuban coast and Cuban waters. And the woman who was a radiologist, working the sonar on the ship, was a Russian who had married somebody in Canada who was head of the company. And she said that they was off the western part of Cuba, and they were in water about 2,000 feet deep. And she said it was like looking down, describing the sonar images, like looking down on a city. You could see, it looked like streets and buildings and so forth. Now, of course, a sonar image is different from a photograph, and the trouble was it was so deep that it was difficult. They did get a camera down on the end of a line 2,000 feet long, but it was very difficult to control it. And they got, the waters were cloudy down there, and they didn't have the top equipment for that kind of work, but they did see some columns and took pictures of columns that had some kind of inscription on them that nobody could read. And the National Geographic got interested, and they were trying to make a contract with the Cuban government and the ADT company to get permission to investigate in Cuban waters. But there was a problem between the Cuban government and the ADT and National Geographic, and never could get an agreement on it, so nothing's been done on it. But it certainly, I